think certainly the move to remote was already starting. We have teams now that are on multiple continents. That's pretty common. But I do think what's happened most recently with the pandemic, of course, has put, like so many other trends in business, just put the whole thing on overdrive.
Welcome to the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast. I'm your regular host, Nate Cooper, and with me this season, I have Eve MacKnight as my co-host. In this season of Cut Your Learning Curve, we're sponsored by Swarm, a digital product design agency and management consultancy. Swarm helps you connect the dots and mitigate the risks associated with launching a digital product, website, or idea. Thanks for joining me, Eve. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Eve MacKnight. I teach about project management all over the United States with my company, Little Owl, and I'm also the Director of Learning here at Swarm.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Eve. If you're new to the podcast, Cut Your Learning Curve is where we help you rethink how you can learn new skills that benefit your professional career and the projects that you want to develop. So let's jump into the episode. This season, we're talking a lot about the future of work and remote work and all kinds of things tangentially in some cases, but in other cases more directly related to our situation in 2020 being as though we're in a global pandemic, and a lot of organizations are thinking about, how work is being impacted, and individuals also are being affected, obviously, by the changes in the economy. So we're trying to pick topics not necessarily directly related to that at all times, but often they do. And this one today, I think, has a high correlation to it, which is about teamwork. So the question we had for this episode is, how do we cultivate teamwork in today's work environment? Maybe I put that spin on it unnecessarily, Eve, but I was presuming we wanted to talk about work environment in the sense that we're doing a lot more remote work these days. Is that what you were thinking?
Yes. I would love to take a step back, though, before we start talking about that, though I think that's a good place to go, is, when I was thinking about this, so Nate and I work in the digital space. I teach project management. And something that's just kind of very interesting in today's world is the one thing that digital offers you that other types of work do not is scale. So you end up with a relatively small number of employees touching billions of people, potentially. Not all websites have a billion person reach, but certainly something like a Facebook does. And as a result, and we in the digital community, we just don't have the same kind of needs for physical goods that you would see in retail or in manufacturing or in some of these other industries. So, and I look at a lot of HR type issues as it relates to tech companies and digital companies and creative agency type companies. And their whole value is their staff. It's not that they have pieces of automated machinery that can cut cars in a certain way. It just isn't. So for this whole community of people that we're really part of, the capacity of people is just paramount. And then on top of that is certainly the nature of how we do our work. For organizations, I do a lot of work with Swarm, which is Nate's agency. For a lot of organizations like ours, I think certainly the move to remote was already starting. We have teams now that are on multiple continents. That's pretty common. But I do think what's happened most recently with the pandemic, of course, has put, like so many other trends in business, just put the whole thing on overdrive. So, Nate, I don't know if you have any first thoughts about sort of how you think about this as leading a company and as a CEO.
Just in terms of how remote work has been accelerated by the pandemic?
I think I meant more specifically how you value teamwork and sort of how you see it fitting in and if and why you value it with your organization. Just start there, and then what do we do to grow it?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's interesting how it was a situation with. I feel in some ways that I've adapted very easily, and that's because coming into operating Swarm was kind of a bit of a change for me. Before that, I was a solopreneur, and I had contractors that I worked with, but didn't directly manage. And basically, I was working from home, and I have done a lot of work from home and remote work for many years. I would say the majority of my career in the last decade has probably been working for myself remotely. And then coming into Swarm, we have offices. Ironically enough, we still pay rent on offices in Soho. So that was that was the difference. So going back to working remotely wasn't as much of a change. What really kind of, I'd say, changed was just how I thought of how you could run a company like Swarm, because I think, going back to last year when I started with the company and took over a lot of projects with existing clients, we were doing a lot of in-person meetings with clients on site. I definitely saw a lot of value in that. That was a nice welcome change for me, is that we have these impressive offices that we can show to people, and we have a meeting room, and it just sort of gives you this sense of being part of something bigger, which Swarm is inherently bigger than my company was when it was just me. But that's becoming less of a requirement. Our same clients that we used to meet with in person, and we really valued that. And I would say even the type of people, like a type of clients that we might be potentially working with during the sales process, where they are coming in and they're sort of figuring out whether they want to work with us, and we're figuring out whether we want to work with them or how we could work with them. I think there's more cachet value of being in a Soho office in terms of just proving your worth as a company that feels like it's kind of been thrown out the door, because we're working with Fortune 500 companies, and we're working with mid-market companies. And I think we're performing the same level, if not better work, with a distributed team than we would have been within the Soho offices. So even though, and I don't know that new company, as we've onboarded a few new clients, again, clients that might have been a little bit more swayed to consider us like a real company because we had these offices. It's just not an expectation. Everybody, it doesn't matter, nonprofit, Fortune 500, doesn't matter the industry. Everybody's working from their home. They have their kids in the background. They have their pets wandering around. It's just something we're all kind of going through as a society. And so this thing that seemed like it used to carry value in terms of giving you a kind of a sense of worth, or just a sense of kind of credibility, like you have these offices, therefore you're a legit company, kind of went away. And it also freed me up in terms of the team to think about hiring people outside of the city, which was not something I was considering before. I did have contractors outside of the city, but I had always thought all full-time employees will be in New York. And now that's not the case. And again, I think we're doing great work, and there hasn't been really a stop from that. So for us, I would say in a way it's improved the situation, because there isn't so much this need to maintain a veneer of we are this cool tech company in Soho, and it's allowed us just to focus on the work and hiring the right people for the right job, regardless of them being in a major city,
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting starting point. For those not familiar with New York City, Soho, south of Houston Street, is an extremely trendy neighborhood, and common celebrity sightings, and it's very cool to be there. This is totally true. I agree with that. And for those who follow, WeWork, the co-working space company, had this huge IPO, which did not succeed right at the tail end of 2019 or through 2019. And, boy, talk about a moment missed. There was, when pre-COVID, so say late 2019, early 2020, at least in New York, their occupancy rate was something like 98%. And a lot of it was 2-3 person teams. We have a lot of e-commerce in New York, a lot of fashion, a lot of media, a lot of retail. And it was fascinating to see that for a lot of companies, especially not only, but especially international companies, just having an address in New York City was significant. And yes, there was something about it. I also think a whole bunch of other reasons why, but certainly the value of physical meetings and in-person meetings did have a certain cachet or value that we have discovered is replicable in this sort of online environment. And, also just as sort of we're 6 months in now, we're recording this podcast, it's mid-September, or 6 months into the pandemic that's affected us here, East Coast United States. I think the other thing there too is when you look at the different industries, by far, I don't think there's anything as comparable as to sort of knowledge workers, digital and non-digital, but essentially people who work in the knowledge working space. Their transition to remote only has been by far the most seamless, and arguably something like education, meat packing, all of these other industries, by far it's been much, much harder. Our stuff was already we were halfway there anyway, a lot of us. That was kind of the joke, that you'd be in an office with 6 people and you'd spend half the day on Slack, which meant you didn't even need to be in the same physical space. Slack, the instant message service, right? So we were just sort of primed already to be doing that. And you hear this from a lot of people who work in IT, in knowledge economy type work, that yes, they're at home, and yes, it's strange, and yes, they have other hardships happening, but for the most part, they're getting their work done. So yes, I do think in a way, and we've been very fortunate with regards to that, as opposed to just the cluster that is K-12 and some of the other industries that are really, really challenged in terms of basic constraints. That said, so that just sort of set the stage, right? So within that, right, like you said already, okay, so for you, Nate, the capacity to hire nationwide or worldwide has been made easier. And then what do you do now that you have this team that's so located across the globe? Sort of how do you think about them, and how do you think about facilitating how they work together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's a problem that I think of it as a problem to solve. In that is the most noticeable loss about not being in an office, is that I don't know, we don't all necessarily start at the same time, or we don't all necessarily we have regular meetings. So I think there is to some extent, week to week, there is structure, but within a day, there's definitely, you don't run into the coffee, run into each other at the coffee pot or the water cooler or whatever, those kind of traditional things where it's just the informalness of being in an office, which is not inconsequential. I mean, it's I think a really important part of building a team, is that you want to think about that we're people, and people are, more than just the job that they do, and that it's important for people to kind of get along beyond just, can you do the work? And I say, I framed it as kind of a problem because I don't know that we have a solution to supplementing that. I think it's been pointed out in that I've hired people remotely, as you mentioned, since the quarantine. And part of what we're doing is that I've made, the one person in particular pointed out that she's never done remote work. She's a little bit more junior on the team. And she kind of brought up this thing that I was just talking about, that there isn't as much of a chance to kind of have this informal kind of get together, and how that's new for her. And so what she sort of said she wanted to do was to focus on company culture. And we're making that part of her job. She's also going to be handling social media, so it overlaps in some respects to the needs of the business. In that social media is sort of about being social, with maybe within a business context, but it's still about the social elements. So she's looking at setting up she came to me with a proposal this week, actually, of theme days or coffee breaks, or group coffee breaks where you intentionally set time aside, and just looking for opportunities for ritual, where we want to do this thing where every Wednesday people give us a status update, but how do we make that not just a status update, but also how's everybody doing, and inject some personality into it kind of thing. So we're looking, I would say, we're at the very early stages of it. So I don't think we have a solution yet, but it's interesting because it's come up with all of the team members, and maybe because they are remote, that we've talked about that at least once with everybody. And other distributed companies are kind of solving for it. If you do, again, kind of frame it as a problem. There's this article that we've been referencing a lot. I forget. Do you remember this one? Because I think we shared it at one point. You might have read it. It was just about how to set up Slack channels and things in a way to create more social opportunities and create rituals around that. The reason I'm thinking of it is it's a company made it as an article about how you can work as a more distributed team. So those kinds of things, I think, are going to be really valuable, and it's why I'm putting energy and trying to help, this one person at least own that part of it. But it's hard. I think it's really hard to figure that part out. I mean, I think the people who have figured it out, I really respect them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks. And I think also why I was asking Nate from his perspective is, again, he's really referencing to a full-time team with some distributed members who are contractors, and sort of their day in, day out perspective as people who expect to continue to work together for a significant duration of time. And I come at it much more from a project perspective, which is very, very time bound. So you have these 6 people, 10 people coming together. They're working for a very short or long term typically with a deadline in sight. But remarkably, what I talk about, the core of what I do is I train project managers, is I talk a lot about this, about how to build these teams. And some of the things I talk about is, again, since we're all coming from different environments, there isn't the same kind of standard procedures that we all share or that we all expect. There are per industry. If you've been at one advertising agency, it's pretty decent chance another advertising agency will be somewhat similar in the way they think about things. But there's still a healthy degree of variation. And even before COVID, there is a huge amount of turnover in the workforce. This has massively accelerated in the last 2 decades from the time before, pre-internet. I think it's interesting, the elements of it that Nate talked about. The way I frame it, because I talk about this a lot, is the importance of having some consistency and clarity around basic schedule, basic communication paths, and role definition. So actually what he was saying about the Slack channels, like that's a very Slack, again, instant messaging system, thinking about like very thoughtfully about sort of how are we structuring that, and then everyone understands some basic rules of the road for how we use it. And then I think the art of this is, yes, then you layer on top of that sort of rituals and play and fun, and also that people feel some empowerment. And that people feel like in their team environments, they have a place where they can both share concerns and also grow. And, I know Nate mentioned some of the things he works on. I work with him, so I know he also does these like regular reviews with his group around, well, what did I think went well? What did I think, he calls it sad, mad, glad. I don't know if you want to talk about that for a second, Nate.
Yeah, I mean, well, so what you're talking about is what we would call a retro, which short for retrospective. So it's kind of like at the end of something that you're looking at what worked and what didn't work, basically. And retros can be at the end of a sprint, like a work sprint. Or what we do is we have a general weekly retro. We're sort of like figuring out the right rhythm because we don't want to do too many meetings, but we might do like a retro that's more project specific in some cases that involves a greater number of people. But yeah, to your point, we're doing like these team retros every week. And the Sad, Mad, Glad framework is just something that I think it was actually used at the company before I came on, and it was just hinted to me that this is a good format to use. But the idea is that you look at 3 pieces of information. So everybody format, it's like, instead of just saying like, hey, let's have a meeting, everybody complain about what happened this week, which is like kind of, I think, the fear people have if you kind of say, oh, let's have a meeting at the end of the week and talk about what worked or didn't work, is that, oh, you're just going to hear a lot of people complaining. I feel that some people just worry that that's what it's going to inevitably be. So what the Mad, Sad, Glad format does is it breaks it out into the mad, which is avoidable things that inhibited you this week. So it's like, stuff that meetings went long. We could have been better organized about that, or we missed this. We showed up late to this thing, or we were like a little bit behind on that because we thought we were going to get this piece of work back at this time, but it turns out that was late and that threw off this deadline, something like that. Those are avoidable things. So we call that mad. And then sad are unavoidable things. So that's where you can kind of vent a little bit. It's just kind of like, hey, so-and-so got sick, and because of that, I had to take on some of their work, and it was a busy week, and, that's what it is, And then you do glad, which is just like, what are you happy about? Like, what are you excited about? What are some wins you had? So as a group, we go through that each week, and from that, we kind of turn it into a discussion. Certainly, like, I kind of facilitate it, and what I try to look for when we go through it is just listening for opportunities to kind of incorporate that as feedback into how we set up the work. Hearing that I'm giving you some actual ones because we just did a retro, but like one of them was like meetings are running too long, and that's definitely an avoidable thing. And I think it's a matter of like having a solid agenda and scoping the meeting correctly and all of those things. That's certainly something that can be incorporated back into the work. But it is a cultural thing, though, too. It gives people an opportunity to have a voice. Everybody has a say in that meeting, and we're all sharing positive and negative outcomes. So I think that because of that, we're getting to know each other, kind of getting to know. We do it at the end of the week too. So people, like, 2 people are traveling this weekend, so it's just kind of like, hey, I'm doing this weekend, yada yada yada. So it's becoming a nice place to get to know each other a little bit better, which builds trust. It just builds a lot of team cohesion, let's say.
I do really like that Nate talked about trust, because trust is such an incredibly intangible thing. And what I think is fascinating, I still remember one of the original guys that helped build the computer with Alan Turing back around World War II time. He died very recently. He was almost over 100 years old. And it was in his obituary that he said, he just never dreamed that computers, as one of the original architects, he never dreamed that they would turn into these vehicles for instant communication the way they have. And that the impact that has on all of us, whether it's instant news, instant messaging, texting, email, whatever format you're taking. And what I always talk about too is that we have so many communication channels and we have so much access to immediate information, and yet the ability to trust each other has in no way accelerated at all, even a little bit. And, it's funny too, because Nate also mentioned this idea of thinking about the constellation of meetings he has during the week. I actually find it hilarious how much time I spend talking about this, how much time in many environments. Like, what does the whole map of meetings of the week look like? For those of you that don't do this for a living, it's a little funny how much time we spend just looking at a big calendar of the week and figuring out how much can we do to get the most out of this group of people without overwhelming them with meetings. I mean, it's just funny, honestly. And it can be really tricky to find the balance, and it's something we really spend time on. And I guess another comment, something else that's really nice, like even an example of ownership. I know the meeting that Nate mentioned, that it was even offered to that group of people, hey, do you want to do it first thing Friday morning? And they said, it is really a nice way to roll out the week or to close it out. So we'd actually really like doing it Friday afternoon. So in a way, it's almost their happy hour. And I like that the group took enough ownership to even say that. And it's a group of people that I don't think are necessarily always used to having that much of a voice. So the more that can be facilitated, I think is great. I think so much of effective teamwork is so intangible and yet so incredibly beneficial. And then something else Nate mentioned a few minutes ago, and I totally agree, is in the remote space, one of the things that is lost is this idea of serendipity of interaction, or serendipity of these moments like at the water cooler. For those of you that study architecture, the Facebook space, the Google space, the new headquarters for REI, which they actually returned. They literally took back the keys and said, you can have this building, and they built it custom because they realized everybody was going to stay remote. This was up in the Pacific Northwest. All of these buildings were really architected specifically to encourage serendipitous encounters. The Google Cafeteria, which is world-class. If you can ever score a free trip to the Google Cafeteria, it's totally worth it. Highly recommend it. It's amazing. And it's true in their campuses in these different parts of the United States. Everything about it is, and they have coffee bars on different floors. They own a large building on the west side here in Manhattan. Is about, can we encourage those encounters? And there's the whole argument for cities themselves. I think I might have mentioned this in a different podcast. One person pointed out, one researcher, that one of the reasons Silicon Valley has such a high percentage of patents is in part because there's such a density of people essentially working on these types of problems. And it's the density that contributes to the innovation. That literally just putting them in the same space, in the same geographical space, promotes creativity. So, I just think it's a cornerstone to the idea about why you pay outrageous rent in a huge super city. Like, this is why we do it. So, and the way these certain cities with the creative classes are really pulling away in terms of cost of living, it all kind of feeds into it. And so maybe now, especially now, as we're really seeing the cities, the places where these businesses are, they're very fundamentally retrenching. As of last week, what I read was office occupancy in Manhattan compared to 98% for WeWork in let's say January 2020. Today, for citywide, not just WeWork, but just generally, office occupancy is at roughly 10%. So it is rampant. And I also think, I don't know, it's so funny to me because I spend a lot of time on this topic and I'm quite passionate about it. I think it's almost like a gut thing when you can just really tell that people are starting to gel. And the more you can create a system where they feel like they have each other's backs and are really in it together and are committed to each other. And maybe that's something a Sad, Mad, Glad helps with, because it's not like one person comes up with the ideas for these unavoidable things. It's you as a group generate ideas to make it better. At least that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we talked, it's funny because you and I talked earlier today, and then it came up again later about this idea of just how I think about personal health and how it relates to work, because two people had like health issues this week and it came up in the meeting in the retro. And I said that, hey, we're heading into flu season, just a heads up, you should take care of your health. And this is something that I value. And I didn't think it was radical. Like, I guess like I was just stating what I thought was pretty much just a fact, which is just like, if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to do good work, And so therefore there's not really a point in like pushing through. We have enough people now. I mean, it is still a small team, but we have the potential to communicate and pass things around and work as a team. So I think that if you're given a choice between I'm horribly sick right now, but there's a deadline, you know what I mean? Like that communication is really the solution to that. And I said that to the team. And to me, it was kind of just a no-brainer. I thought I was stating what the obvious was, but like at least one person on the call said that like they were really appreciative that I said that because they worked in other environments where that wasn't the case. And I don't know. I mean, we're living in a pandemic. Obviously, like health is a major thought process. And I just feel like it was a great opportunity to be able to kind of express that to the group. And I feel like it came across with a lot more weight because it was just in a retro, and it came up very naturally because that was where the conversation was. And it wasn't like I was talking through policies or that, we're going into like a workshop on communication. We were just sort of informally talking about, our week, and people were talking about stuff that happened. And for me, as kind of the leader of the team, like it felt great that I was like, I'm so glad that like we as a team like got that out in the open, and that and basically everybody had an opportunity to kind of weigh in on that, and like I said, the feedback was positive. It's good in a way because I feel like that's really the biggest risk I think with the distributed team is communication, and then there's a human element, like we're all human, so like people are gonna get sick or something's gonna happen, whatever. It's really hard to predict. You just know that there's gonna be stuff, and so being able to kind of like say that, I think in that context really helped a lot. Like I'm glad that I said it, and I'm glad that I said it in that context. I feel like that context had, gave it a lot more weight in a way. I mean, we could always do another topic on it. I know there's a lot to say, and I didn't even get to mention that I took your team building class earlier this week, which was amazing. It was great. Yeah, Eve, why don't you tell people how they can be in touch with you?
I'm at Little Owl, and my latest classes I teach worldwide now is facebook.com/Little Owl with a 1, and my website is littleowl.us.
Awesome, and I'm at Nate Cooper on Twitter. Thank you for listening. See you at the next episode.
Thanks for tuning in to learn with us today. This has been the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast sponsored by Swarm. Don't forget to go to swarmnyc.com/learn. There you can sign up for our email newsletter and connect with us on social media.
Thanks, Eve. And again, my name is Nate Cooper. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day and happy learning.